Thank you so much. So welcome to our St. Paul Learn with the League with St. Catherine University, welcoming the Dear Neighbor Project. Tonight, we'd also like to thank the St. Paul Neighborhood Network and SCC TV Suburban Community Channels for broadcasting and taping tonight's program. You can check our YouTube site and view previous programs anytime. For over 100 years, the League of Women Voters has worked as a citizens league to improve our government and engage all citizens in the decisions affecting our lives. The League is a nonpartisan membership organization dedicated to you, our community. We study issues, we take positions, and we take action. You can check out our websites for St. Paul, Minnesota, and the National League to learn more about membership in the League of Women Voters. We'd love for you to give us a try if you're not already a member. Tonight, we also want to acknowledge that we're learning on the ancestral homeland of the Dakota and the current home of many Native nations, including the Dakota and Ojibwe. Please remember that land acknowledgement is only one small part in supporting Indigenous communities. We hope our land acknowledgement statement will inspire others to stand with us in solidarity with Native nations. Thank you. Our program is being recorded and broadcast on Facebook Live in addition to this Zoom. So feel free to type in questions during the presentation and we'll answer as many as we can at the end of the talk. Remember, the Zoom is closed caption feature is auto-generated, so there may be occasional inaccuracies. The 2023 election calendar is fairly quiet, but we do have a primary in Minnesota on August 8th and the general election on November 7th. In St. Paul, we will have some seats up for city council and school board. So pay attention for some candidate forums and voter guides coming from your local leagues this fall. We're here to help you make informed voting decisions. Moving on to tonight's topic. Redlining and other kinds of racial housing discrimination is a phrase we've been hearing a lot more about in the news and other programs. In 1917, a Supreme Court case ruled that racial zoning ordinances interfered with the right of a property owner to sell to whomever he pleased. 5 years later, Atlanta city planner Robert Whitten wrote this in a professional journal. Race zoning is essential in the interest of the public peace, order, and security, and will promote the welfare and prosperity of both the white and colored race. He continued, a reasonable segregation is normal, inevitable, and desirable. His zoning plan for Atlanta was challenged, and the Georgia Supreme Court ruled the plan unconstitutional. Atlanta officials continue to use racial zoning maps for decades. And we'll hear that this story can be heard across many other cities in the United States. As we continue to learn about and examine this part of history, it's interesting to learn about the local stories. So right now, we wanted to launch a poll to hear your thoughts about this. The poll will be launched and you can answer the question, does your house have a racial housing covenant attached? And there will be a couple options, so you can see yes, no. If you don't know, if you haven't read it yet, we'll learn more about how you can do that. Or if you have had one and had it removed. So I'll give that a couple seconds for you to answer that poll. These are some really great answers. Can we end the poll and share the results? As you can see, a lot of no's and I don't know. So I'm really glad that you're all here tonight to learn more about this, and maybe you can do some of your own investigation on racial covenants on your house. So thank you so much. So joining us tonight is Dr. Rachel Neiwert from St. Catherine's University Center for Community Work and Learning. Dr. Neiwert will introduce welcoming the Dear Neighbor and further introduce the work of the students who are researching with this project. Also joining us are students Sophie Gibson, Tessa Schoenecker, and Maya Isabel Villafuerte. Thank you so much for sharing with us tonight, and let's get started.
All right, thank you so much. We're so excited to be here. Let's see. Sophie, Tessa, and Maya, I think you can turn your video. Oh, good. You turned your videos on. Well, thank you again for having us. We're thrilled to get to be here to share the work that we've been doing together. And so the way we put together our presentation is I'm going to start and share just some background on what the Welcoming the Dear Neighbor project is and what we've been sort of overview of what we've been working on. And then I have a story that I'm particularly interested in that I'm going to share a little bit about. And then Sophie, Maya, and then Tessa will each share a bit about the work that they've been doing, highlighting a particular story that they've been learning more about. And then I'll come back at the end to suggest some action steps and sort of bring us to a conclusion. And our hope is to leave some time for questions at the end. So we'll be excited to hear what you think too. So let's see, Beatrice, I think you were going to share the PowerPoint. Perfect. Thank you. Like Heidi said, the four of us together plus a variety of other faculty, students, and staff at St. Kate's work on a project called Welcoming the Dear Neighbor with a question mark at the end. Our project started really about a year before the pandemic as Mapping Prejudice, which is based at the University of Minnesota, was finishing its work on the Hennepin County map. And there was discussion about could the project come to Ramsey County? And because St. Kate's is in Ramsey County, we worked and partnered with Mapping Prejudice to help bring that project to Ramsey County. So we helped the Deanne Lesh and the Community Work and Learning Office at St. Kate's worked with Kirsten Delegard from Mapping Prejudice to negotiate with the county so that Mapping Prejudice could have access to the deeds. And then, of course, those negotiations took a while. So it was just before we all got sent home in March of 2020 because of the pandemic that those deeds were up online. So during that first year of the pandemic, a lot of the work that we did was co-leading with Mapping Prejudice sessions to help people learn how to do the deed transcription work for Mapping Prejudice. But a lot of the work that we do with Welcoming the Dear Neighbor is we want to come around and inform how the map came to be. So if we go ahead and move to the next slide. So this is the Ramsey County map. So I just put the Ramsey County map up just because it because that's where our work and the stories we're going to share tonight in our work. So this map, all the green on this map shows the presence of racial covenants in Ramsey County, at least what we found to this point in time. We think it is possible there are some additional covenants, racial covenants in Ramsey County that just weren't found in that first sort of group of deeds that we had to search. But Mapping Prejudice's work is really to create the map, and their project is entirely remarkable. Historians have known about racial covenants for quite some time, but nobody had a method by which you could holistically see the presence of all the racial covenants, or as many as possible in a given community, until Mapping Prejudice developed its method. And it is incredible to be able to see it, right? To sort of see the map and get to zero in on a neighborhood. Our work with Welcoming the Dear Neighbor is not so much to build the map. Our work is to think about how the map came to be and think about the stories in our community that shape the creation of the map to look like this. So we are learning about racial covenants, but we're also learning about the other strategies and tools, which are all quite horrific, that white neighbors in St. Paul used to claim neighborhoods as white spaces. And so actually the 4 stories you're going to hear tonight from us don't actually specifically have to do with racial covenants. They're stories of neighbors who utilized other means to claim space as white space. And I think that's a really important thing to remember, because it's easy to think with racial covenants that, they were illegal, and so now it's okay, it doesn't matter. But in fact, that's not actually the case, right? Because racism is entirely nimble in really terrible ways. And so as racial covenants became illegal, neighbors found other ways, right? White people found other ways to claim space and claim neighborhoods for white people only. And so we want to bring all those stories together and sort of think about all those pieces put together to tell the history of the place that we live. So why don't we go ahead and move to the next slide, and I'll tell you a little bit about a story that I've been particularly interested in. And I want to especially, I'll give you a broad overview of the story, but I'm especially interested in this story in the way that women show up in this story. So that's what I want to focus on. In May of 1909, in the Crocus Hill neighborhood, in this home here on Lincoln Avenue, this home still stands today. It's just a couple of blocks south of Grand Avenue. Two families moved into two apartments in this home. So the upper level of the house was one apartment, the lower level of the house was another apartment. The two families that moved in were both African-American families, and they were the first African-American neighbors to move into the Crocus Hill neighborhood. And their white neighbors were not particularly happy at their presence. And so the white neighbors formed a neighborhood association to try to do work to push their new neighbors of color out of the neighborhood. Now, interestingly enough, the home was actually owned by an African-American dentist, and he rented the property out. And the neighbors did not seem particularly fussed at the notion that he would own the house. They just seemed fussed at the idea that he would rent the house to African-American families. Now, the family that lives in the downstairs apartment moves out pretty quickly once the neighbors start doing things like breaking their windows and ringing the doorbell at all hours of the night. On the second floor, though, was a woman named Mrs. Jackson. I find her particularly interesting. She doesn't move out as quickly, in part, she says, because she has a hard time finding another place to live. But I am interested in the variety of ways that she gets characterized in the different newspaper stories that I can find that tell this story. So I can't find this story told in any of the African-American newspapers that existed in the Twin Cities at the time. I can find this story, though, covered fairly extensively in the local St. Paul newspapers. It's also covered in newspapers, and just to note, those local St. Paul newspapers are really white newspapers. I can also find this story covered in newspapers actually around the country, both white newspapers, and the first encounter I had with this story was in an African-American newspaper that's based in New York. So the words that you see here on the slide, and I'm not going to read them out loud to you only because the language is so offensive, by and large, are all the different ways that Mrs. Jackson is described. Now, Mrs. Jackson appears to have been an older woman. The newspaper articles have sort of inconsistently say whether she lives alone or whether she lives with her husband. Some of the stories say that she's a widow. Some of the stories say that her husband travels for work and that he just isn't there when this is happening because he's away working. So it's a little hard to know. So there's not, whether there is a Mr. Jackson or not, there certainly isn't a focus on him, but there is a focus on her. And what I think is interesting here is, right, again, these first three quotes that come from the newspapers. First we have, they take these pains to say that she's inoffensive, right? There's these efforts made in the newspaper stories that try to be somewhat supportive, at least, To say that Mrs. Jackson is not offensive, to say that Mrs. Jackson is respectable, right? Whereas we have other stories, right, that want to be clear about who she is and what her racial identity is, right, in a way that is intended to be offensive, okay? And this particular, I think this is an interesting feature from the newspaper, right? You can see, I'm going to read the title at the top here only because I know it's a little tricky. This is, of course, not language that we would use today, but what this picture is captioned at the top, it says, and I quote, "Scene of the colored invasion." And just again, to be clear, we're talking about between the two families, it's less than 10 people who've moved into this neighborhood. Let's move to the next slide. So here again is two different ways to think about who was Mrs. Jackson. So the newspaper story on the left, I think, is fascinating, right? It describes Mrs. Jackson. It talks about the sort of terrible things that the neighbors are doing, hurling bricks through her window. It talks about how the police are doubling the number of patrolmen. And then it says this. Well, earlier it describes her as being armed to the teeth. And then it says this. Mrs. Jackson today said to a reporter that she intended to stay there and that she was armed. She spoke of her neighbors as white trash. That's a quote. They are among the wealthy people of St. Paul. And this is a fascinating story or way to describe her. It's 1909. And here, right, what she says is, this is my home and I have the skills and the ability to protect my life in my home, right? And it's a pretty bold thing for a woman to say in 1909, never mind a woman of color. But other newspapers described her this way. They said that she was trying to get away from the neighborhood, but that she'd been compelled to remain there so as to force a sale of the property at an exorbitant price to the adjoining neighbors. So the white neighbors argued in part that Dr. Bell, who was the African-American owner of this particular home, that he had deliberately moved these families into this home as a way to offend the neighbors in the hopes that they would pay him a huge sale of money to sell them the house so that these people would leave, right? So in the second quote, Mrs. Jackson is depicted as a pawn, right, in a story that isn't of her own making. Whereas in the first story on the left, right, she's an actor in her own story. So a couple of things that I think are interesting here. One, this is 1909. It's right before we see the first racial covenants in either Hennepin County or Ramsey County. In Hennepin County, the first one shows up in 1910. In Ramsey County, the first one shows up in the early 19-teens. And this is a moment in 1909 where it is as though white folks living in predominantly white neighborhoods realized that perhaps their neighborhoods might change. And they were trying to figure out what to do, right? And they did terrible things. They broke windows. They yelled horrible things at their neighbors of color. And eventually, of course, what will come are racial covenants as a way to claim space as white space. But I do think it is also interesting to think about how women are implicated in these stories, because the neighborhood associations are almost always about men. But often when we look at these stories of who lives in these homes and who's being pushed out, these are stories about women and children. Now, sometimes the women get erased from those stories. That's what I think happens in the story of Nellie Francis that you might be familiar with. In those newspaper stories, she isn't mentioned at all. But I do think it's interesting to think about the ways that Mrs. Jackson is at the center of this story. And somehow the way that she gets characterized becomes the justification for how she's treated, right? Either the fact that she's respectable is the reason why we should think it's okay that she lives there, or the fact that she's not respectable is the reason why it should be all right for her white neighbors to push her out. And so this connection between sort of gender and racial exclusion is an interesting one that I've been thinking a little bit about. So I'm going to turn things over to Sophie, who's going to tell us another story about another person who's around at a similar time to Mrs. Jackson. So we can head to the next slide.
Hi, my name is Sophie, and I'm a second-year history and art history major at St. Kate's. Over the past summer, and I guess the past coming up on a year now, I've been doing a lot of work with Dr. Neiwert, as well as Maya, and recently Tessa, just working with the Welcoming the Dear Neighbor project. And I'd say broadly is how I would describe my work, is kind of giving attention to stories that often go untold, stories that both shape this map we've been talking about and kind of result from it too. Ultimately, I want to center like the real people that were impacted by unfolding housing discrimination in the early 20th century. And one name that I came across a lot in my research would be that of Frederick McCracken, who was a realtor and activist during the early 20th century in St. Paul. So before I get too into him, his specific life story and work, I just wanted to read a quote that was written by him, like his actual words. And so this is very much hearing from him as well as me in this bit of presentation. And this was said in a newspaper in, I think it was around 1919, something around then. But he said, "It is true, a large majority of the Black community reside in the Rondo Street section, so called. We have constructed our churches and other buildings, housing or community activities in this section, but our movement to this locality has been a volunteer one, and we would strongly and bitterly resent any attempt that may restrict us to this particular locality." So essentially what he's saying is that anyone's moving to or from a given neighborhood should be of their own choice. Nothing should restrict people in moving to or from, which is clearly not the case in the Twin Cities in the early 20th century and onward. And we know that he strongly resented that, and a lot of his work did have to do with working to kind of uproot and combat the forces which made it that way, where people were very much restricted to any one area. And I just wanted to quickly say that all of my information was sourced from the Minnesota Historical Society digital newspaper database, as well as the actual physical archives as well. Yeah, so now to get into his story, and this is also a picture of him, by the way. He was born in 1879 in Mount Pleasant, Iowa. He eventually did move to the Twin Cities in 1900 at the age of 21, although there wasn't much written about what brought him to the Twin Cities specifically, which makes sense given that he appears in the Minnesota newspapers once he arrives in Minnesota. It can be inferred it might be because he had some family ties in the area and also was offered work. So after he moved to the Twin Cities, he did find work in the realm of politics, and that led to him having to move back to the East Coast, specifically Washington, D.C. for about a decade or so. But eventually he did come back to the Twin Cities. And although the exact dates are unclear, he did marry a St. Paul woman named Nora Gadet in 1911 and also became a father as well. Like I said, specific dates are not recorded for a lot of these things. It's kind of a timeline that we're working to piece together through many, many newspaper articles. But throughout his time in St. Paul, it is believed that he resided at 852 Albemarle Street, which is in the north end of St. Paul and still stands today. Eventually, though, he did relocate to New York later in his life. Again, the reasons are unclear, as are the exact dates. But he did relocate back to St. Paul at the age of 63 in 1942, and he stayed here for his last couple years before ultimately passing away of illness in 1944. And we can go to the next slide. And now just to get into some more specifics of the work that he did. He firstly, when he moved to the Twin Cities, found work as a stenographer under a congressman. And that man was named Fred Stevens. And like I said, is the reason he had to go to Washington, D.C. I'm not going to go too into the details of his early work, but he was described as being very efficient and popular within the workplace. After his time in DC, he did go on to serve the U.S. Housing Corporation as a special agent between 1914, 1918 or so, just essentially during the First World War, when this corporation existed to create quality neighborhoods for the workers who were being sent to work in shipyards and arsenals in order to aid the war effort. In this job, he did serve as the lead on housing for war workers of color, and again, was described as being very effective at his job. Sometime after the war, again, exact dates are unclear, he did move back to St. Paul, where he began much of the work that he was known for as a real estate and insurance agent. Much of his work was done as he sold homes to Black families in St. Paul. Many of these homes were in the Rondo area and were later demolished with the construction of I-94. If you take a look at the pictures that I have, the first one is like a bird's eye view of the Rondo area prior to the construction of I-94. As you can see, it looks like a normal neighborhood. And after, I think they're lined up almost exactly. You can see the highway cutting through much of the neighborhood and altering the way it looks and the way it is and what houses were standing there. Something also interesting to note is that in these newspapers, a lot of times it was mentioned what addresses he was selling. And out of curiosity, I looked up most of them just to see what the houses look like, and they just don't exist anymore. And it's just probably due to the construction of I-94 and, again, other things too. In addition to doing this work as an insurance agent, he later went on to be an apartment superintendent in New York City from 1933 to 1942. But again, like I said, he did move back to the Twin Cities. Alongside all of his career endeavors, he did also serve on other various committees and boards. Too many to list, but the main ones that I were reading about were as the chairman of the Urban League, as well as the vice president of the St. Paul Business League. And he, in the Urban League, focused on housing inequalities, specifically pertaining to the Black community. The Urban League is a civil rights organization, has chapters all over the nation, and is broadly centered on the economic and social justice pertaining to the Black community. And McCracken's work centered on housing, of course, and it was said that his experiences as both a real estate agent as well as a housing corporation officer lended him like a valuable perspective that no one else could replicate in that job. And yeah, I mean, that's pretty much the story of Fred McCracken, at least enough of what I was able to find in the archives. I doubt we'll ever know everything there is to know about him, which is unfortunate, but I don't know, I think it's important to know his story. He's very much situated in the context of housing issues in the Twin Cities. He was one individual working to combat this housing discrimination while also building community in other areas, and is broadly a individual who was working hard to combat issues that occurred on a systemic level. And yeah, I guess my finishing thought is that he did a lot of exceptional work during his life, and I really think that people should know his name. I would have never known his story or of his work if I hadn't, been looking around in the newspapers. And yeah, I just think he's a name that we should know. He was an exceptional advocate and person for the Black community and beyond in St. Paul in the early 20th century. And I think we can go to the next slide, which is going to be Maya's presentation. Sorry about that.
Thank you, Sophie. Hi, everyone. I am Maya Isabel, a third-year student at St. Catherine University studying history. And kind of like Sophie said, this summer she and I spent a lot of time researching under Dr. Neiwert about different things and institutions within our community as a part of the Welcoming the Dear Neighbor project. And so one area of focus that Sophie and I particularly researched was called the Catholic Interracial Council. So it kind of started up in New York in the 1930s, 1934 to be exact, and it was started at a small parish by one Father John Lafarge. And essentially he and his parish decided, it was also during this time, it was kind of the beginning and middle of like the housing crisis and disparities between BIPOC buyers and white buyers, kind of like what Sophie was talking about with Fred McCracken. And so basically what Father Jean Lafarge noticed was that Catholics really need to take care of their neighbors. Like that's a big deal in the Catholic faith, is this idea that you have to take care of everyone under your watch. And that includes your neighbors, including BIPOC neighbors. And so this kind of revolutionary idea was kind of like sparking up all around the nation as like more discussions about housing disparities were kind of rising up. And this led to nationwide chapters of the Catholic Interracial Council. Their small like grassroots organization was really starting to catch fire in other places. And you can kind of see, I included a picture of like a Catholic Interracial Council, like a membership pin from a chapter in Chicago, which was one of the really big chapters too. And another reason that like these chapters were so accessible to people was just that it was a really grassroots structure. It was really based in like local and community aid. And so that's kind of what really got it started. Like people wanted to take part in this, like local parishes and churches would get together with community members and their neighbors, and they would talk about these issues and try to educate like their neighbors and their friends and try to resolve some of the like interracial issues that were coming up during this time. And so this is kind of what kickstarts the Twin Cities chapter of the Catholic Interracial Council. So that one starts a little bit later, about 20 years after the New York chapter. And so that one, as I said before, was kind of starting during like the housing disparities. But now that we're in like the 50s, we're kind of getting closer to that civil rights era and like the very inklings of like integration and all that. So obviously there's a lot of uproar at this time. And there was need for the Catholic Interracial Council in the Twin Cities. And so it began in 1958. And next slide, please. Thank you. So with the Twin Cities chapter of the Catholic Interracial Council, we saw a bunch of mobilization within the community, which was really great for this time period. And so this like ended up with the creation of several different programs, one of which was the branch's newsletters, which I included a picture of. It's this bright blue pamphlet. And essentially it was a monthly newspaper that went out to community members and members of the Catholic Interracial Council themselves. And it basically was a detailed list of what other chapters were doing, as well as like community actions that were going on and community actions that they then see a schedule of things that people could participate in. And it's really interesting because Sophie and I actually got to sit with these physical documents and read them this summer, and they were fascinating. You can see a bunch of little personal touches of the people who like wrote the documents, and you can see like actual community reaction to like the programs that were being enacted in their own community, which is just really great. And so one of the programs that's mentioned within the branch's newsletter is something called the Home Visits Program. And so this is something that was largely utilized by students at the time, which I also thought was really interesting because obviously me and all my research partners are students. So that obviously stood out to me. But the Home Visits Program was essentially a program that allowed BIPOC community members to allow students into their home and kind of bridge that gap and try to like demystify BIPOC people in the eyes of white people. And I can see how like today that would kind of seem voyeuristic, but at the time it was really helpful for their community. And within the branch's newsletter, there was a lot of positive feedback towards this program. And they actually extended it a little bit further outside of the Twin Cities as well. And so we actually wouldn't even have access to any of these documents without talking about this amazing woman, Patricia Capone. So we actually met her this summer and we did an interview with her as a part of Summer Scholars. And essentially, Patricia Capone was one of the founding members and eventual secretary of the Twin Cities Catholic Interracial Council in 1958. And so she is a St. Kate's alum. That's how we got in contact with her. But she also lives in the neighboring Carondelet village. So we went to her apartment to talk to her about some of her work there, as well as some of the things that we found. And so she actually donated a lot of her artifacts from her time at the Catholic Interracial Council. And that's how Sophie and I were able to see some of her documents and photographs and read through these newsletters. And she is just an amazing woman, and I really thank her for letting us look through all of her objects and sitting down and talking with us, because she told us that like they really felt like they were going to change the world. And that really stood out to me because she was so inspiring. And she was like, for an older lady, I expected definitely some hindrances in this progress, but she said that they were really determined and they like were out in the community and were really trying to change legislation. And that was really cool. despite all this, like this go-getter spirit, though, she said that they weren't actually able to make much headway in terms of legislation, but the program was a big hit within their own community. And I feel like that's really what I was trying to look for. Me and Sophie particularly were trying to look for this summer with the Catholic Interracial Council. Like we are trying to understand the power of community in aiding in interracial injustices and fixing them within our own communities. And all of that starts in-house. We have to educate each other and work together to fight injustice wherever we see it. And Patricia Capone did an amazing job of explaining that to me and Sophie this summer. And you can go ahead and head to the next slide and we'll have Tessa take it away.
Thank you so much, Maya. So my work focused primarily on the St. Paul Human Rights Commission, which is a government department that had kind of nebulous beginnings. As far as it goes back as like a separate department, it was established in 1957 under a different name. But what we know as the St. Paul Human Rights Commission was established in 1967. And they are both an investigative and prosecuting body. How their process works is if someone encounters discrimination, and this can be employment discrimination or housing discrimination, which was obviously primarily the focus for welcoming the Dear Neighbor. What they do is they can submit a complaint to the commission, who will launch an investigation, basically to figure out if there's probable cause or probable evidence that discrimination did occur. And then they can actually prosecute the individual, which is something really interesting. And I thought this was personally really interesting because it kind of works to track housing discrimination in a different way than we see with the racial covenants. Obviously, the racial covenants are underground to a certain level, but they're in the deed and they're very obvious to see once you've found one. These complaints are about incidents that if the complainant hadn't chosen to report it, it could have gone unnoticed and off the record forever. It's primarily one-to-one interactions, and it relies a lot on witness testimony. And it just really shows kind of what Dr. Neiwert was talking about before, all the different ways that neighbors in St. Paul were claiming white space. It could be just a flat-out refusal to rent to people of color. See that a lot. Property neglect, where a property could literally become uninhabitable because the manager was refusing to maintain it in an attempt to force their tenants out. A lot of just straight up intimidation because, you know, I don't know where that sentence was going. And there's a ton of different documents in these complaint files that help us kind of track the story of what happened. So there will be the initial complaint where the complainant will kind of describe what happened to them. There will be a lot of interview transcripts where commission officials followed up with them to try and get more information, where they interviewed the respondent. Sometimes there will be court documents outlining the proceedings, and there's a lot of interdepartment communication to kind of describe what they were doing and what was going on. So for my section tonight, I just compiled 3 of the stories that I found that I think are good examples of specific things that you see a lot and things that are really meaningful to this work. So we can flip the slide. So our first one happened at 472 Holly Avenue in 1967, where a Black man named David Rooney, who was a representative of the Youth Opportunity Center, called to inquire about renting a room on behalf of a student. And he was asked if the student was Black and told that if that was the case, then the room would be unavailable. So what he did is he submitted a complaint to the commission, and they were able to open an investigation. And what they did is they sent a white secretary in to call the apartment and then arrive in person to see if it was still available and if the owner would rent to her. And she documented every interaction that she had with the owner. She documented every time they spoke and what was said. And using that, the commission was actually able to
formally prosecute the owner of the property. And what they did is they ordered the respondent to submit regular inspections of their tenant records. And if they turned down any tenants, they had to formally report to the commission why they did so and why they chose to do that. So this is kind of like one of the commission's success stories where they were able to follow up with the complaint, confirm that something had happened, and hopefully serve some justice, make some reparations. We can go to the next slide. This next one, however, is kind of a little bit of a different story. So at 1880 East Iowa Avenue in 1968, a Black man named Limos Farr claimed that his landlord was trying to force him out of his apartment by not providing sufficient heat. And he claimed that the temperature had led to the death of his infant son. The landlord claimed that the temperature was always set to 77 degrees and Farr could leave if he found that unreasonable. And as I mentioned before, a lot of these cases just come down to testimony versus testimony. But I personally do not believe that this is the truth. I do not believe it at all. But what happened was Farr left that address, he moved away, and the commission lost track of his mailing address. And they couldn't follow up with him. They couldn't pursue the case anymore because they had no way to contact him. And the case is just listed as a failure to pursue because there was nothing more they could do about it. And this is unfortunately actually a really common situation in a lot of these complaints. And it's a really vicious self-fulfilling prophecy because these people are living in dangerous or uninhabitable situations. So they leave, and by leaving, the commission can't contact them and they can't continue the case and try and make things right. So we can just move to the next slide. So the last case I have for you today happened at 26 Douglas Street, and this happened in 1970. A white woman named Dolores Sana began her lease here at 26 Douglas, and literally the very next day, her landlady, who was named Lena Rainelli, found out that Sana's husband was Black and told them to evict. They submitted a complaint to the commission, and the commission began their interviews. And during her interview, the landlady Rainelli told commission representatives that she knew her rights and she knew that she didn't have to rent to people of color. And then her daughter, Margaret, actually began to harass the Sanas. And at one point, there's an incident report where it appears that Margaret physically attacked the couple while they were leaving their house. And this was because she was attempting to retrieve their rent receipt so that they would not have proof that they had already paid their rent, and she and her mother could have a reason to evict them. Luckily, the Sanas were not holding on to their receipt. The commission was holding it for them. And when Margaret was told that the case had been submitted for prosecution, she actually brought a doctor's note with an opinion that her mother was unfit for court in an attempt to get out of it and avoid accountability. Once in court, she pled guilty on her mother's behalf, and they were sentenced to a $100 fine. So something that we've discussed among ourselves is how these stories seem to kind of work on like an ascending scale. Sophie's story with McCracken focuses largely on an individual working against a system. Maya's focuses on a community organization that was working a lot on social change and maybe fell a little bit short on legislative change. And mine is a government organization that has the power of the law behind them and still comes up short a lot of the time to really make the changes that they needed to. Oh, sorry, we can go to the next slide.
All right, thanks, Sophie and Maya and Tessa. So I think Tessa's conclusion is a really important one to think about. right? These stories are interesting because they feature individuals doing work, they feature community organizations and state organizations doing work. And right by themselves, the different groups doing work certainly make a difference for the different individuals that they encounter, but it doesn't always successfully overturn the structures. And so, right, our project, welcoming the dear neighbor with a question mark at the end, part of what we're trying to interrogate is, were we good neighbors here in St. Paul and Ramsey County more broadly? And certainly the history would suggest that to our BIPOC neighbors, we were not good neighbors, right? That is the history of the place where we live. And there are so many different places and times over the course of the 20th century where you can see that. So, for us, what's next is to continue our work and sort of see what are the other stories we can find that help to illuminate this history, that help us to think about the role of community organizations, the role of state organizations, the role of individuals, including women in these stories. But I also think it's a reminder to all of us, right, in terms of what do we do next. Certainly this work has made me think a lot more, particularly when I'm voting, right, about implications for housing policies in terms of, policies that might, laws or ballot measures that might be on the ballot, but also in terms of candidates, right? Because feeling bad about the past doesn't necessarily make things better, but thinking about what we do in the present, given that this is the history of the place where we live, is important, I think. One last note before we open it up for questions, and I'm sorry, I forgot to say this at the beginning. So we've been giving presentations for the last 3 years or so to all different audiences about our work with welcoming the dear neighbor. And we're, of course, always learning from those presentations. And one of the things we've learned over our time giving presentations is that the language that was used in the past to refer to people of color, some of which was clearly a slur in the past and remains a slur today. But of course, there were also words in the past that were used to refer to people of color that were just considered the acceptable word to use in the past, but are no longer the acceptable word to use. And what we've learned from presenting is that for some people, hearing those words that today are not appropriate, but were acceptable in the past, it can sometimes be quite hurtful to hear that language being used, especially to hear it being used by, in the case of the four of us this evening, right? We are people who identify as not as white, as not being members of the BIPOC community. And so we make the choice as a project team to not repeat that language out loud as best we can. There are moments where, because maybe it's too small or the copy isn't good enough, that to make clear where it says what it says, we feel like we do need to quote it. But as best we can, we try not to repeat that language because, of course, we don't want to inadvertently cause harm to anybody who's listening to our presentation. And again, my apologies for not saying that at the beginning to sort of set that up as an expectation for how we would continue. But that's what we have for this evening. We're happy to answer any questions, any other questions that you might have.
Well, great. Thank you so much for being here and for sharing all this wonderful information. I hope it's a kind of a softball question to start. But I've also worked in historical research and worked with primary sources. So I was just curious as to what your favorite primary sources were while you were doing this research and investigating these stories.
This is a great question. Let's see. Tessa, Sophie, and Maya, you want to start? You have a favorite? or favorite
Well,
kind
I
of
know
source?
that for my section, we had to particularly focus on like the archives at St. Catherine University, just because that's where Pat Capone left all of her things. And that, and me and Sophie spend, and Tessa, we all spend a lot of time in the Minnesota Historical Society archives or their online newspaper hub, which I believe you linked in the chat. So I know that those two are my primary sources, just like the physical resources as well as the Minnesota Historical Society.
Yeah, I really only worked with the Human Rights Commission records. So I have to say they're my favorite, but I feel like it's a really good segue to answer one of the questions that's in the chat. They are available at the Minnesota History Center archives. You can look up their filing number online, or the people there can help you. It's really cool to just be able to hold those physical records and, see these people's handwritings and kind of get a glimpse into their lives.
Yeah, just to quickly answer the question too, I think that some of my favorite things were the documents and photos that we had in the St. Kate's archives. It was just really cool to see a piece of personal history, something that's on campus, like literally in the basement of the library. But also it was cool to get to go to the Historical Society and get to just like work with these massive boxes full of documents. And of course, I do love the online digital newspaper work. It's nice to be able to do it from literally anywhere. And I think that was a big part of why I did Fred McCracken, is because his information, it's so accessible. If you have the internet, you could read his story, you could find it out.
I mean, I love it all because I'm a historian and that's a cheating answer. I know. Though I will say that, I mean, the newspapers I think are fascinating to look at. But one of the pieces from the collection here that we've talked about that I really liked reading were actually the branches newsletters that come from the Catholic Interracial Council, because there are such little tidbits there that you would never find somewhere else. So, I mean, one of my favorite things that I found there was a small article in this newsletter about a Catholic school in St. Paul, where the teacher had her 8th grade class send out a survey to like the neighbors around the school, asking them, like the survey questions were about like, how would you feel if an African-American family moved into your neighborhood, right? And then the students apparently, it said in this article, like collected the surveys and like wrote a play based on what they learned that they performed at the school. And I mean, I haven't yet been able to find any other information about that, but like, isn't that a cool thing? And like, such a good reminder too, that, right, like if a classroom full of 8th graders could do that, like, it seems like there's not a lot of limits to what we can all learn and do, right? But I thought that was a particularly delightful piece.
Wonderful. And as a shout out to the Gale Family Library at the Minnesota History Center in St. Paul, I love that too. You can always make an appointment and do your own research as well. We do have a question, if you have some more information about the current status of covenants, and I know there's a couple resources to help get them removed, but do you know how many there are and how many have been erased? I know people are working to have them be removed.
So in the state of Minnesota, you can't erase the covenant, you can discharge the covenant. So, right, it adds language. Discharging the covenant means that you add language to your property deed that says that you disavow, right, this language. And I mean, for me as a historian, I would say that's good, because we don't want to erase them, because if you erase them, the risk, of course, is that, you can forget that they were ever there. And we don't want to do that. I don't know the exact number of covenants that have been discharged. The Just Deeds organization is one that is partnering with different cities to help people to remove covenants from their homes if they have one. At the Mapping Prejudice website, when you look at the map, you can actually search the map. If you live in Hennepin or Ramsey County and you're interested to know if there is a racial covenant on your own home, you can search the map, you can put in an address, and if there is a racial covenant, you will, it'll be marked, and you can see the text of that covenant and the year that that particular covenant was added to the property. So that would be one way. I think there was a question about how you could find out if one was there. That would be the place to go. In terms of how to discharge a covenant, I think the best resource is the Just Deeds organization, who can provide advice about how to do that. And my recollection is that just in the fall or in the late summer, St. Paul announced a partnership with Just Deeds, right, to do that work of discharging covenants. But we always want to remind people too, that, you know, it's not just covenants that did the work historically of keeping neighborhoods white. It's these other actions as well. And so as we think about how to reckon with the history, we want to be sure to reckon with all the pieces of the history.
Yeah, I always thought that was what was really interesting about the difference between this project and kind of how Mapping Prejudice started, is looking a little bit beyond just the covenants themselves and some of those other community works and things like that too.
Well, and it's
sorry.
I was going to say, it's also, I think, important to note that in the mid part of the 20th century, as covenants become unenforceable and then illegal, of course, what happens, again, because racism is horrifically nimble, other tools come along to replace covenants, right? So, I mean, zoning is one tool of the later 20th century that replaces covenants. So that, you know, that it's almost like a lineage, right? That you can sort of trace the steps. And it's terrible and deeply damaging to the communities that we live in, and deeply damaging to people who were trying to build lives and homes and couldn't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was an interesting transition, because we did have that question, like, what do you see as kind of the modern version of racial covenants? And since they are illegal and no longer houses, we obviously see some of that still happening today. So thank you for that. Thank you for answering that question as well. Through your research, Maya and Sophie and Tessa, have you seen any progress over the time through the changes over time, especially starting from Mr. McCracken back in the early 20th century and kind of leading up to the 70s, the 50s and the 70s, and even today?
I can go first. I think most of my work, at least with Fred McCracken and such, was, you know, at the turn of the century. But Maya and I did do work this summer in the Como Park neighborhood that was related to more recent occurrences. We did oral history interviews with current residents to just kind of see the legacy of these racial covenants in the Como Park area, in the makeup and how people experience things. So very much a little bit of a leap from, you know, early 20th century to people who are very much alive and well now. Same with like Patricia Capone. She's still alive and well, although her experiences are mostly from the 70s, 60s, that kind of year. I think that at least I've definitely gone back and forth throughout the 20th and now 21st century in my work.
Yeah, and kind of going off of Sophie, like when we were doing that work within like Como Park, like you can, like when we were speaking with some of the residents there, they said that it definitely has changed, because a lot of them said that they've lived there generationally, like their great grandparents owned the land and built the house, and like they've seen it change. But at the same time, it kind of is going back to what Dr. Neiwert was saying, like it's not just racial covenants that keep neighborhoods the way that they are. Like if any of you know the Como Park and like Highland area, like you know that they're predominantly white areas. And they're areas that had a lot of covenants. And even though those covenants like aren't enforceable today, or some people have even had them like removed from their deeds, a lot of those neighborhoods are still predominantly white neighborhoods. And that's purely through community. Like if you have mostly white and like intergenerational people living there, like realistically, there's no room for growth. But at the same time, that doesn't mean like growth can't happen. And there has been like obviously a lot more BIPOC families have moved into the neighborhood, which is really great. But it just is interesting to kind of see how that past translates into the present.
Do you, I see 3 questions here in the chat. Do you want me to take a quick tool through those 3 questions, or I know it's 8?
Yeah, I was gonna say we've got so many coming in, but I know I want to respect time. I was gonna end with the where do you see your work going next question, if that was okay. But if you wanted to cover some of those others as well, that you can feel free to do that too. But thank you so much for being here. And where is your work going next?
Yeah, so we'll do where's the work going next, but I think I can do the other 2 that I see there pretty quickly, just so that I don't want people to feel sad if we didn't answer their questions. So we have done a fair amount of work in African American newspapers. So a lot of Sophie's works looking at Fred McCracken came from the African American newspapers. One of the things that I think is really interesting is that in some ways the African American newspapers aren't actually our best source of information. So like the Crocus Hill story, for example, not covered in any of the local African-American newspapers. The Nellie Francis story, right, which is a little bit more of a known story, is covered a little bit, but not very much in the local African-American newspapers. And I think this is because of 2 reasons. I think one reason is that African-American newspapers at the turn of the century served a number of functions, and one of their functions was to prove that African American people should be recognized as full citizens. So it was about proving respectability, which meant that, right, the kinds of stories that they're telling are very carefully, I think, curated in some cases. For, again, a fairly terrible reason, because they have to make the case to the wider public that they're citizens. Also, though, I think housing segregation and discrimination was so pervasive, it simply wasn't news. And a newspaper is intended to share news, right? The reason that properties are often clustered with racial covenants, one is because it's often developers who are creating racial covenants. And so they're covering an entire neighborhood. But it's also really interesting. We do work with a group of economists at St. Kate's as well. And one of the things they're looking at is how many racial covenants does it take in a neighborhood? Do you got to cover the whole neighborhood? Or can it be more sporadic? And it turns out it can actually be more sporadic, and the racial covenant still has the same effect, which is an interesting thing to think about. So where we see our work going from here, these are all stories that I think we'll keep pulling on. The next direction, though, that we're interested in learning more about too, is the intersection with education. Because of course, for so many people, where they live is about the school district where their kids are going to go to school. And that isn't just true today, it was also true in the past. So we've done some initial work, and we were hoping to maybe talk about some of that tonight, but we need to do a little more work to put some of those stories together. But that, I think, is the next direction that we're headed.
Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate you all being here and sharing these stories. And can they find out more events that you're doing on the website?
Yes, we're working on sort of keeping a website is a tricky thing. It turns out, I'm sure that you all know that too, because I know you have a very robust website. So we are certainly doing our best to keep that website.
We'll keep an eye out too, and then hopefully invite you back as you continue to do more research.
We'd be delighted to come back. So thank you so much for having us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you all for being here. I do want to share as we close tonight that our next month's topic, we are partnering with the League of Women Voters of the Roseville area, and it will be about restorative justice. What is it and how does it work? And we're proud to partner with them to present County Attorney, John Choi, Rosalind Harmon, who is Executive Director of the Dispute Resolution Center, and Tina Seigel, Manager of Restorative Justice Community. That will be on February 21st at 7 p.m. on Zoom, and you can register on our website, state website, or the League of Women Voters Roseville area website. So thank you so much. We appreciate all you being here tonight, Rachel, Sophie, and Tessa and Maya. Thank you so much for sharing your information. Thank you also to the program committee for your work behind the scenes, the Roseville Area League and the White Bear Lake Area League for being partners with us in this journey, and to SCC and SPNN for broadcasting this as well. Thank you for joining us tonight. We really appreciate your questions and taking your time to spend with us and going over. We went over just a little bit tonight. We really appreciate it. And we will hopefully post this soon. Thank you so much.